From WBRNRadio and on the Boston Red Network. Special programming today, the state of Minnesota versus Mohamed Noor. Noor is a former Minneapolis police officer. He's accused of killing Justine Ruszczyk.MPR. It was an unfortunate situation. It happened in the alley directly behind her home. She called 911 and called her husband, who was on a business trip, and explained to him she heard some noises in the alley. She later went into the alley and in her nightgown, and was shot by this Mohamed Noor, reaching across the police cruiser. His partner Hannity was the driver. It was an unfortunate situation out there, and not only was it very unfortunate, it was a situation that police-involved murders, the majority of them are police officers shooting African Americans. Justine Ruszczyk was an Australian national, therefore she was a European. So it set things on their head. Period. This is a very contentious trial that has not met any of the norms that we normally hear of in these type of actions. There was one Fernando Castillo that was killed in the neighboring city, was a native of St. Paul. He was killed in one of the suburban locations around there, but photographs of him, of course, were taken by his girlfriend as he had been shot, and photographs of him from the cam were shown on television, the local networks, etc. And that was the precedent of a so-called high-profile trial. He was charged and he was acquitted by a jury. Now, this particular trial coming up here, the state of Minnesota versus Mohamed Noor, seating is very limited. It's a small courtroom. The press is limited. The national press, the New York Times, is, I believe, the only one there. And there are several local media outlets. Perhaps the the AP is there. I'll go back over that as we move through the broadcast. But it is very, very unusual for this happening, and the limitation on the public that will be able to attend this particular trial. I believe 7 more seats were added on Monday. But at the same time, because of the limited public viewing, and also the photographs, etc., there will be shown to the jury, but not to the people even in the courtroom. So why is all this information being suppressed? We don't actually know. I'm assuming that the court feels that it would intensify the atmosphere by letting more people in, at the same time showing photos of her body. They have an overflow room appearing there in color. It would show the blood. She was basically shot in the chest, and it went through the body, the heart, etc. So she was basically dead, was dead at the scene. And this the defendant, Mohamed Noor, has not spoken to investigators. He's had nothing to say. On Monday in the courtroom, he was introduced by his attorney, and there were 75 prospective jurors. Now this is another sort of catch there. Out of a pool of more than 200 jurors, several police types were in the pool. The chief of police was in the pool, and her fiancé, Mr. Damon, was also in the pool of jurors. Now, he was not one of the 75, but they will select 12 for the trial and 4 alternates, so that's 16. Normally there are 2 alternates, but in this particular case there's 16. Now the jury is not being sequestered. Usually if they're worried about security, it would be like the OJ jury where they would be sequestered. They are figuring now on 3 to 4 weeks of a jury duty. Now that will limit some people from serving on the jury that can't be off from work, financial hardship, for 3 to 4 weeks that they would set through the trial. We will go over the questionnaire, and the reason we're doing this, not every question, but some of the questions, these are what the jurors were required to fill out. Let me just go to that, and then we'll fill in some of the background information here that we have gathered over the last few days. First of all, the petition to prospective jurors. The information in this questionnaire is for the judge and the attorneys involved in the case. Remember that you are under oath, and as you answer these questions, please keep in mind that there are no right or wrong answers. Please answer all the questions as complete and honest as you can. You must not discuss your answers with any of the other jurors. If you need help completing the questions, ask one of the clerks. If you want to make additional comments, please use additional blank pages. Do not write on the back page. We'll append this incidentally, so we won't go over all of these, but to give you a somewhat of a feel for what is going on here. Okay, this is the background information. I wish they would have put a PDF here. Maybe we can make this a little bit larger. This would help. Okay. The jurors are all numbered. And this will actually help out here. The number, the age, the occupation, the employer, what city or neighborhood do you live in, how long have you lived there, how long have you lived in the county. Please list other places you have lived over the last 10 years. Approximately how long you lived at each location. Then they asked marital status, married for their single, widowed, and a number of years, remarried, living with a partner for a number of years, separated, divorced. What is the age, grade, and occupation of your children? If you have any, please include children from your or partner's previous marriage. And they have the age of female, male, occupation, etc. there. And then what were the occupations of your parents? What is the highest level of education you completed? Less than high school, bachelor's, some college graduate, postgraduate work or degree. If more than one high school, please put that down. Are you currently, please all that apply, employed full-time, part-time, unemployed, employed in more than one job, temporarily laid off, a homemaker, retired, disabled, or student. List all current and previous occupations and employers you've had in the last 10 years. Do you have had any management or supervisory responsibilities to any of your jobs, including a military service? That's another question they asked. Have you ever held any kind of leadership position at work or or as part of a community organization? List occupations, education, backgrounds of any other adult in your household. Has anyone close to you died as a result of another person's conduct? Do you own a firearm? Mohamed Noor is a Somali-American citizen. Do you know any individuals of Somali descent? Yes and no. Have you ever had any previous positive or negative experiences with persons of Somali descent or heritage? Yes or no there. Is there anything about Mohamed Noor's ethnicity that would affect you, would be difficult for you to presume he's innocent of all charges against him? Yes and no. And then they ask other questions. Have you been a victim? Have you or anyone close to you ever been a victim of a crime? They ask that witness a crime, been involved, been interviewed or questioned by the police, and they lynched self, family, spouse, friends, been interviewed or questioned by an investigator or attorney, been interviewed, etc. Been convicted of a crime, including a DWI, brought charges against another, someone, asked for or received a restraining order or order for protection, been a subject of a restraining order or order of protection, been a witness in court, sued someone or been sued, been involved in any lawsuit or legal proceeding, been the victim of a crime that was not reported to police. And then they give the option, is it you or your family there? Have you ever served on a jury or grand jury? Yes or no. And what kind of case did you hear? When and where did you serve on the jury? Was the experience favorable? Yes or no. Were you the foreman? I'm not sure why they asked that question. Now, have you any of your family or close friends ever been, ever had any training or work in any of the following: legal attorney, legal secretary, assistant investigator, courts, judge, court clerk, law enforcement, police, sheriff's department, state police or FBI, corrections, probation, halfway house, mental health, psychologist, counselor, psychiatrist, social worker, assistant, medical ambulance, hospital emergency room, ETM, etc. Pretty thorough here. List any organizations you belong to or in which you participated. That could include veterans groups, service clubs, social clubs, etc. Have you, anyone you know, ever belonged to or donated time or money or services to any organization that deals with the subject of physical abuse or assaults? Have you or anyone you know ever contacted with had contact with a victim of physical abuse, etc.? And they go on here, if you answered any of those questions, have you or anyone close to you been employed or have any dealings with the county, the county's attorney's office, the county sheriff, or the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, the Minneapolis Police Department, any other city, county law enforcement agency? Have you ever had an experience involving law enforcement beyond that described in number 33? This is 34. Let me just move on down. These are law enforcement. You will be hearing testimony from a number of police officers in this case. Do you think you would give police officers more credibility, less credibility, or the same amount of credibility as other witnesses? And this is important. But people fudge on many of these questions. At the time of the incident, Mohamed Noor was employed as a Minneapolis police officer. Is there anything about the nature of that employment that would cause you to be biased for or against Noor or the state of Minnesota in this case? What are your sources of news? Radio, and they want to know what station. Television, what channel. Newspaper, what newspapers, plural. Magazines, not internet, what website? Well, that's kind of a crazy question right there, because you could probably be looking at hundreds of websites. Do you watch any reality TV shows? Cops, America's Most Wanted. Do you watch any television shows that involve fictional criminal stories? CSI and Law and Order. Trial of publicity. Very important. Defendant in this case, Noor, is charged with second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter for causing the death of Justine Ruszczyk on July the 15th, 2017 in South Minneapolis, Hennepin County, Minnesota. Noor has pled not guilty and is presumed to be innocent of each of these charges unless and until he has been proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in the trial. Have you read or heard anything about the case or the people involved? Did you see or hear any newspapers about it? A yes and no there. And then you list TVs, tabloids, radios, internet, websites, news, newspapers, including print and online, internet, chatter, comment sites. That's kind of poorly worded there. Which of the statements below best describe the amount and degree of information you have about this case? I have seen and heard enough to believe that I know exactly what happened in the case. I have heard or seen bits of information. I wouldn't say a lot of information, but I have seen or heard coverage. If they watch local news, they've heard this, or read local newspapers. I've heard or seen coverage, but I do not know much about the case. Most of these people, if they got a summons to go to the jury, they check the papers. That happens all the time. If you read or seen anything about the case prior to today, please describe what you heard, saw, and when. Have you heard anything about the case? what sticks out in your mind about Justine Ruszczyk, the woman who was shot? Well, she was from Australia. Have you had any conversations with your family, friends, or co-workers, other people you know about this case? Yes or no answer there. Have you read about, heard about, or talked about the case? Does anything you've read, heard, or discussed about the case affect your ability to presume Mohamed Noor innocent of the charge? Yes or no. Then they asked about some of the people involved. Do you or anyone you are close to have or do business with any of the following people? The judge in the case, Mohamed Noor, Freeman, the state's attorney, and Sweezy. These are attorneys Plunkett and Peter Ward. Under our system of justice, the defendant is presumed innocent of the criminal charges against him. Do you agree with that principle? Yes or no. Under our system of justice, the prosecution has the burden of proving the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and they will explain to the jury what reasonable doubt is. 58, the jury in this case will be instructed not to read, watch, or listen to or access the internet for news accounts. Would you find it difficult to follow such instructions for any reason? Is there any reason you would not be able to give your complete attention to the trial over the next 3 weeks? This is where jurors' hardship cases come in. Do you have any religious or philosophical beliefs that would make it difficult for you to do the job of a juror? Do you listen attentively to the evidence of her instructions on the law to confer with your fellow jurors in order to determine whether the criminal charges occurred? Do you have any medical, visual, hearing, physical, or other impairments that may affect your ability to serve? In other words, a medical discharge you'd get there. 62, because this case involves a death by gunshot. Is there any medical and there will be medical examiner testimony, autopsy pictures, as well as body cam findings, footage from the scene that is graphic. Do you anticipate you would be trouble listening to or viewing this evidence? And do you have any major conflicts, such as a non-refundable ticket that would interfere with your ability to serve between now and the 1st of May? Is there anything else the judge or attorneys should know about your ability to be fair in relation to serving on a jury? Yes or no. Is there any subject covered in the questionnaire that you would not want to discuss in front of other jurors in open court? Yes or no. What questions are those? And you put those down too. And let's see. Oops. I'm just about finished here. The last question, 66. Please read the attached list of potential witnesses and circle the names of any witnesses with which you or someone you know have an association or whom you think you recognize. And then you affirm on the penalty of perjury that I have given complete and honest answers to all questionnaires. You sign it and date it. And we will just append this here, so you can have it, and we'll have to get it down. Okay. This is from the public news NPR. 75 people known only by numbers and cards hanging on their necks begin filling these out on Monday, the start of the trial of this Mohamed Noor. Security was high at the county government center given the high-profile nature of the case. Dozen officers, sheriff deputies were around. Potential jurors were run for additional weapons screenings and asked to turn over all electronic devices. The judge involved said threatening calls have been made to her chambers. She is Catherine Quintance, I suppose is how she pronounces that name. Noor is charged again with second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter for shooting and killing Ruszczyk, also known as Justine Ruszczyk. That was in July of 2007, after she called 911 because she thought she heard a woman being assaulted in the alley behind her home. Every chair available to the public and media at the hearing was full, including reporters from Australia, Ruszczyk's native country. The trial is expected to last 3 to 4 weeks. Quintance told the jury, prove that they are not investigators and should avoid all media reports on the trial. She told him that they'll be known only by the numbers until there is a verdict. The state, she said, must provide prove charges beyond a reasonable doubt, adding there's no such thing as an innocent verdict in the American judicial system. The verdict is either guilty or not guilty. Yeah. In an order Monday, Quintance said her office received threatening calls, we already talked about that, concerning her rules on evidence to be allowed and excluded during the trial. Because of that, she said jurors' identity will remain confidential to protect them from unwanted publicity, harassment that may endanger their partiality. The questionnaire included, we already went over that, who Mohamed Noor is. He's Somali. And another question asked potential jurors if they feel they have been treated unfairly by a police officer, and they would have an amicus there, they call it. That's what they're getting at there. Juries in these types of cases are notorious for siding with police officers. This is evidentiary ruling here. I think we can get some of this up here. Psychiatric exam excluded from trial in Ruszczyk's case. This is initial psychological test for the force, and his decision not to cooperate with investigators will not be allowed as evidence against him at trial in the shooting. He pled not guilty. Quintance said that she might reconsider her decision on the psychological exam, and Noor's silence should Noor testify during the trial. That's a very interesting concept. She also decided not to admit evidence of previous bad acts on his part, including when he pulled a gun on a motorist. That's very important. Now, if one of these jurors is reading this and doesn't say anything about it, that mindset is there. And today, with the information that you have, in the old days, we did not have this type of information. Therefore, we had newspapers, radios, and TVs to a certain extent, not social media for the most part. Even in the early 90s, social media was not as ubiquitous as today. She said she would allow the 911 call. He responded to Ruszczyk's neighborhood 2 hours before the shooting and denied Noor's request to separate the second and third degree murder charges against him, saying that the evidence and witnesses all overlap. 4 key questions on the pretrial coverage. Noor is charged with second-degree murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter in this case. Noor's defense wants the jury to be able to watch an impact of bias video out of the federal courts in Washington. Noor is Somali, and of course whose attorneys said he knew another case in Minnesota where a Somali person was involved and where the video was played to jurors. War also mentioned statements by President Trump regarding, Muslims and whether they should be allowed in the country. We can't pretend unconscious bias isn't amongst us all, he told the judge. The prosecutor, Linton, countered that the video, which starts out with images of segregation, Japanese internment camps, has never been used here, and cites research and studies that they wouldn't be able to discuss with jurors. Fernandez says she doesn't want a jury to see the video that's not evidence. She declined to allow it into evidence, said the issue impact bias could be addressed elsewhere in the trial. And the pre-hearing lasted about 35 minutes there. Authorities set up metal detectors on the floor. That is not of primary importance. Let me find my overlay here as we find some more information we had initially got to gather here. Okay. This is from the local newspaper. The headline here is former Minneapolis officer's trial opens under intense scrutiny. And this was dated the 30th of March. Former police officer will stand trial Monday for the first time in recent memory on a murder charge for killing a civilian in the line of duty. The national conversation has largely centered around the white officers killing black men or African Americans, but Damon is a European woman from Australia, where media outlets have closely followed the case. And Noor, 35, is a Somali-American, a community that has made strides in Minnesota, which faced, while facing discrimination and global scrutiny. Noor, who was a police officer at the time of the shooting, is scheduled to stand trial in the court. Noor is the second Minnesota police officer in the last 3 years to be prosecuted for on-duty killings. Now, I want him to pay for this crime. This is from Ahmed Youssef, a local Somali-American writer who has published a book on Somali Minnesotan experiences. I want the victim to get her justice, but on the other hand, how many of this profession has gotten away with this kind of crime, and how many of them? Experienced defense attorneys who have helmed some of the state's most high-profile criminal cases say they are not certain either side has the advantage going into the trial. Very interesting here, and will be watched from around the world. As far as I've read, it's a 50-50. It's 50-50 as to who will win the case. That's from attorney Earl Gray, who was part of the team that successfully defended. This is St. Anthony, Minnesota police officer Geronimo Yasneen. That was in a Philando Castile's case, an African American killed there. It's nearly 2 years between Yasneen's acquittal in Noor's trial. About 24 officers across Minnesota have been cleared of criminal wrongdoing in 15 fatal shootings. Justine was acquitted of second-degree manslaughter and 2 counts of reckless discharging of a firearm at the end of a 3-week trial that was nearly deadlocked. While the circumstances in both cases vary greatly, the common thread has emerged between the prosecution of Justine and Noor. And both of these individuals, Justine was Mexican-American. Prosecutors sought to contrast the defendant's actions to that of police officers to show that the shooting diverged from the best practices. That's a big argument. The trial arrives amid tight media scrutiny, public restrictions established by the judge. It will take place in a courtroom that holds 30 seats, smaller than others in the criminal courts building. She also ruled that potential graphic evidence such as body cam footage, medical examiner photos will be shown only to the judge, the attorneys, and the jury, not the public in the media gallery. A mistake. I do that because of the privacy issue involved. A shot in the night on the night that Damon, she was a spiritual leader and meditation coach, was engaged to be married, got the 911 call about 11:30 to report a possible rape in the alley. Noor and his partner, Matthew Harity, responded. While in the alley, they were startled by what Harity told investigators was a loud sound, such as a slap on the squad car. Damon then appeared at Harity's driver's side window, which was open. Noor fired a single shot across his partner at about 11:45, killing Damon. She was not armed at the time, and they found no guns or drugs in the house. The Minnesota officers have typically given statements to investigators within days of the killing. A civilian usually stating that they feared for their lives. That's usually which is a lie. Nearly all have later been cleared of criminal wrongdoing by grand juries or the county attorney. But if seasoned defense attorneys are right, Noor may break his silence at the trial. Quintanans has ruled that no one else can testify about Noor's state of mind at the time of the shooting, a criminal element in determining whether his actions were reasonable. The law itself is basically paramount on how he views the circumstances, what was reasonable from his perspective. So I don't see how he cannot testify. That's Joseph Daly, a professor at the Mitchell Hamlin Law School, Professor Emeritus. That's always going to be very difficult and a strategic decision for him and his lawyers to make. Noor's attorneys haven't said whether or not he will testify. Usually in these cases, the defendant does not testify, but Gray put Justine on the stand and said he would have Noor testify. But that does open up a can of worms there. Gray is he got to tell the jury what kind of person he is, and they are looking over at this fella, and they want to hear from him. A lot of Justine's case is they heard from him, and would tell he was very distraught. Well, Noor has not shown any sign of being distraught. Obviously, he'll put on a show. Bob Bennett, now, he's representing Damon family in the civil lawsuit. Damon's fiance, Don Damon, is expected to testify at the trial. He was not at home at the time of the shooting. The murder and manslaughter counts against Noor span a brief of history definitions that can be seen contradictory at times and confusing at others. They all call for jurors to place themselves in Noor's mind at the time of the killing. Ultimately, the case will hinge on whether the jury believes Noor's perception of the threat was reasonable enough to merit a deadly force. Did the police officers have sufficient reason to fear for their life? And that's from another attorney, Joe Freeberg. If he did, then he can act with reasonable force. If he didn't, he can't. Another attorney here, Francis Scheim, has researched and published articles showing that civilians struggle to differentiate legal definitions when addressing defendants' mindset. The bottom line of the research is that jurors sometimes have a very difficult time applying the law as it is intended. It's tough for lawyers to explain for the jury to understand exactly what the differences are between those three charges. Dennis Poussant, a juror in the Yazin trial, said at times that the jury focused on the defendant's culpable negligence in their week-long deliberation over whether to convict the officer of second-degree manslaughter, one of those against Noor. The majority was evidently able to sway two holdouts after analyzing the legal definition of the charge. Poussant said, who described their deliberation as very difficult. Negligence is something that all of us are capable of on a bad day. That's a generalization. That's from Freeberg. It's negligent to run a stop sign. However, he added culpable negligence is something most of us would never do because there is an inherent risk in that we would not take driving 100 miles per hour on a sidewalk because you don't see someone on the sidewalk. Jurors can acquit or convict Noor on any combination of the charges. Some defense attorneys say jurors may want to give each side a break and acquit on the most serious and on the lesser crime. That has happened in trials before, but in general it does not necessarily happen. We're also going to put an item from the bulletin here from the Minnesota Judicial Branch. This is the state versus Mohamed Noor. You can sign up to get updates, and it also has here amended order of conduct at the trial. Order of conduct at the trial. This is dated the 28th of March, 27th of March, and state's response to court's proposed anonymized jury. State's response to defendant's third motion in lane. Waiver of appearance for trial management conferences, and these are all the motions ordered on a pretrial dated. They're all basically in March of this year, some in February. State's response to exclude a reading here. State's opposition to motion to sever counts, and we talked about that. So in other words, you can look at the trial, especially for our listeners in Australia and other places that have not had an opportunity to read this notice of visual and audio coverage. This goes back into January, some orders and motions here. So you can use this as basically as your casebook here, and more NPR here. Who the victim was: Justine Ruszczyk. She was 40 years old. She was a yoga and meditation teacher, and she always used the last name Damon. And they have started to use the hyphenated Ruszczyk Damon here, because they would have been married shortly there. And they show the judge, who is someone who's been around a very long time, and the prosecutor, and some of the other people here. The partner, Noor's partner, he attended, and they talk about the police academy in 2016. Both of these characters were relatively new to the force, which is very unusual. You usually don't pair relatively new people together. Worked at the department's 2nd and 3rd precincts. On July 15, 2007, he was driving the squad car. But he graduated with a law enforcement degree in 2015. And let me see, in 2016. So both of these characters had been around a year or so. I think this is the same situation with Noor. Noor was a little bit different. He had 2 citizens' complaints that were dismissed without discipline. A 3rd is still open, so he has been a problem child. He graduated with a business degree in 2011, previously worked for a healthcare company, a hotel, and a mobile phone company. So he comes from a totally different type of background. From the evidence that they have on him, he was a person that was not very good at dealing with the public. Period. He was discharged by the Minneapolis Police Department in March of 2018. After he was charged here, he paid $90 to renew his Minnesota State Police license 3 years later. Waste of time, because no one is going to take this character on because of liability of the department. And I don't think I can a YouTube video she had. I don't know. Oh, this is a very long one. I don't think we're... Wait a minute, just a minute here. No, we are not able to do this. There is a picture of her. Maybe we'll link to it. We'll figure something out here later in the ball game. Now, there's another public radio article here that more than 2 years ago, this Mohamed Noor was one of 27 candidates sitting in a classroom, his first day in the police academy. And it shows who these people were. He majored again in economics and business administration. Then he worked as a hotel manager someplace over the year. The Minneapolis police force has been slowly becoming more diverse. In 2016, 24% of the officers are people of color, 15% are women. So it is more diverse than it was. He went through the cadet program. That's something that's been around since 2089. The current chief here is the Minneapolis chief is one of the first graduates of that program. The head of the Coppers Union was not a fan of the academy. He said he prefers the city hire people who pay their own way through a to our 4-year program and pass the post-exam. They should be the ones we are hiring, and this guy has a reputation in Knoll as a fascist, because all you've got to do is put them in the academy, and they're on, and they're ready to go. So this is the program. The city needs more officers. Department is about 30 below, according to this character. He said he thinks the cadet program is slow and expensive. He thinks cadets are, of course, well trained. Well, I suppose they are. But anyway, this was the program that he went through. Things we'll be watching on this trial. We won't really be watching it, but be watching from the coverage. Will be what the composition of the jury is in terms of race and sex. There are more men, as I from initial reports, in this pool of 75 than women. Women would be more favorable, generally speaking, to the prosecution. So they'll try to get as many men on this as they can. African Americans in particular would be more sensitive to Justine Ruszczyk's cause because of the work of Fernando Castillo's mother, Mrs. Castillo, has spoke at rallies for Justine Ruszczyk, and worked with Don DeMond. So those are some of the things that we will be looking at in this case, and the evidence, how the attorneys define the charges. Culpable negligence, for one. The defense attorneys are trying to keep it simple, like the idea of driving 100 miles an hour on the sidewalk and you didn't see anyone. But this reaching across the front of his partner is very, very unusual. The partner said he had his gun out, but it was not up where the woman would have seen it. Now, there were no witnesses to this except a bicyclist that came across the alley. But he did not witness the particular situation. The cams were not there, orchestra cams were not on at the time, nor was the cam in the top of their car. So in other words, they could have cooked up any type of story. And this is what's going to be really scrutinized in the international coverage. It's going to be much, much more difficult. Fernando Castillo received a lot of international coverage, but not the kind here, because here you have an Australian national, you have Australia being a member of the Commonwealth. So you're getting, and on top of that, you have the situation happening in New Zealand there. So in other words, a totally different type of situation. The father of Justine Ruszczyk is a bookseller, at least he was at the time. They had been in Iran. She lived around the world. Very learned and scholarly man, but doesn't understand why this would happen to his daughter. And he wants justice for his daughter. And you could expect any family would want justice, just as Mrs. Castillo wanted justice for Fernando. Philando did not get justice, unfortunately, but his memory is there. He was a cafeteria worker. He supervised a cafeteria in St. Paul, Minnesota. I believe it was a middle school. I'm not certain about that, but he was loved by the children there. He knew each and every one of them. And the difference in his situation was he had a firearms permit, and he actually had a firearm, but he was wearing cargo pants, and he had to get to his permit was down there, and I believe his gun was in the band of his pants. But he informed Yazoo that he had a gun, and Yazoo just basically lit him up was what the story there. We don't know what happened to Yazoo, because after the trial, he was fired from that police department, and he disappeared from the radar. Probably his whereabouts will come up here. It's also important to note that this Mohamed Noor did not live in the city of Minneapolis. He lived in one of the suburban communities, as many of these coppers do. Evidently the chief doesn't. Well, he could live in the county now, because now that's another thing also. This jury pool will come from not only the city of Minneapolis, but the entirety of the county, which is Hennepin County. So that will impact who you're getting, because there's small towns out in the county, and it's a different complexion when you leave the metro area. The city of St. Paul and of Minneapolis are different from some of the smaller towns that are out in the county. Amy Klobuchar, who is running for president, used to be the state's attorney in that county. So she would be a source. So in other words, that is another source for the national news. So we got some very interesting things there. She was scrutinized for when she was a state's attorney. She never charged any police officer at that time, and basically ran a law and order program. Maybe she won't admit it now, but the times were different. And that's one very important situation. The times were different, and we are looking at everything from a different lens. It's what happened in Chicago with the young man there that had alleged a hate crime. Charlotte, however you pronounce his name, Charlotte. And then his charges were dismissed by the state's attorney there, and she is on a criticism from the police union. So what's happening in Chicago is a transition. You have today is the mayoral election in Chicago. 2 African American women are running. One is chair of the Cook County Board. The other oversees the professional responsibility part, police officer special responsibility section there in Chicago, and was a federal attorney there. So you have those two, Pitwick, or whatever her name is, and then you have Lori, what was her last name? I'll have to look that one up. But they are running, and what that means is a change in composition in the city of Chicago. And you had the police types demonstrating outside of the Cook prosecutor's office, and the Rainbow Coalition under Reverend Jesse Lewis Jackson. His people were there demonstrating on behalf of Kim, whatever her name is. I have to look that one up. But the whole situation there, we were going to do something on that, and I talked to the Chicago ad lady, Emma Young. Unfortunately, I woke her up, so we'll have it tonight on what happens in Chicago. So they will have an African American mayor that will be a woman, and a very interesting dynamic there. The state's attorney there now in Cook County is an African American. So what we're having is a change. Whereas in this other county where Castillo was, there's a person of color there, Mr. Chu, an Asian type, is the state's attorney in that county. So we're seeing some changes here in terms of the composition of the police force. More people of color, more women coming onto the force. Chicago is, of course, behind on that, but the change is coming. There's no doubt about that. Different administration, different situation. They had a conviction down in Chicago of a police officer, and you'll see more of the same. There's a police officer in Dallas, Texas, killing of Mr. Jewell, I think his name. I don't know what his name was right now, but Anyway, he was killed by this police officer that had moved into the building, his apartment building, and claimed she was at the wrong suite, and knocked on the door. He answers the door, and she claimed she thought he was in her apartment, and lit him up, as they say, on the street. So all of this situation which killed him. But then they found police paraphernalia, handcuffs, they haven't said, on that situation. But that trial is coming up also. So we're having various situations here. Attorney Crump is, of course, on the scene there. He was not involved in the DeMond case here. It's a guy named Brown. Now, Brown was also the attorney for the Castile family. So he has a number of these cases, civil cases, that he has been the lead counsel in. And one of the, as we move out of this presentation, one of the situations here, sort of like when a police type is charged with violation of federal civil rights, the way the statute is written makes it almost impossible for them to charge a police officer. It comes down to intent, and that is the way this was set up. So the law itself, the statute there in Minnesota, needs to be modernized and start looking at the circumstantial evidence here. There's no dispute that Noor fired the bullet that killed Justine DeMond. The only disputed situation is he and his partner, and the partner incidentally did talk to investigators and claim that they heard a sound hitting on the car, but again, no one was there but them. Was that a sound or not a sound? One of the sort of sideline issues here is the judge told him to stay away from his partner. The partner, incidentally, is still working as a police officer, and this is part of the problem that you have. Noor was suspended, then he was fired. So, but the defense is paid for by these police organizations. On the 2nd of April, a Boston Red here in the Jerry Pippin broadcast booth. The episode has been the state of Minnesota versus Mohamed Noor.